Chapter 2. The Brakey. Maudie stretched to peer into the bushel basket filled with string beans. A sigh escaped her lips. They had been snapping beans for hours and hours, and she still could not see to the bottom of the basket. Vigorously she began snapping beans one after another and throwing them into the dishpan that stood in the center of the circle. Maudie, Giddly, Sarah, and Mother had risen early that morning to pick beans, and before 9 o'clock had filled almost 2 bushel baskets. Now they sat in a circle on the porch, snapping beans and telling stories and playing games. Maudie scratched her head and yawned. Then she pushed at the cat that lay beneath her chair. "Maudie, you remind me so much of how I used to be when I was a little girl," Mother said. "Did you have to do beans all day long when you were little?" Maudie asked wearily. "Of course. And I always thought when I grow up and had a garden I wouldn't raise green beans." "Then why do we?" "What would we eat if we didn't have beans?" "Oh." Maudie had not thought of that. "How would you like to do this all by yourself, like I had to before you children were old enough to help?" Mother asked, looking around the circle in appreciation. "Oh, Mother, I don't see how you did it," Sarah answered sympathetically. "Well, really, my garden was the one bright spot in my life at that time. You know how we had to live on Dottie's, meaning grandfather's, farm until Father was old enough to be on his own. The garden supplied most of our food, and it was something that I enjoyed. And you know how I like apricots. I planted lots of little fruit trees and enjoyed watching them grow. Everywhere we've lived, I've planted apricot trees, but this is the first place where they died." She raised her eyes to scan the treeless prairie, and Maudie wondered if she were wishing they didn't live here. Maudie loved the prairie with its wild grasses that tickled her bare feet. She enjoyed the mockingbirds that sang every morning, and she didn't mind that they had no apricots to eat. The name didn't even sound appealing, and she wondered if they were really very tasty. Wild plums were good enough for her. Yes, that's right. Wild plums and jackrabbit meat was all they needed to keep her satisfied. Absent-mindedly, she nodded her head. Giddly looked at her sharply. "I thought you had fallen asleep," he said. Maudie felt ashamed for not thinking about what she had been doing. She filled her lap once more with a large pile of beans. Then she looked up at Mother and said, "I can't understand why you and Father had to live on Dottie's farm so long." Mother took a deep breath and explained that they had gotten married when Father was only 19. Boys are not considered old enough to be on their own until they turn 21, so they had to stay and work for Dottie until Father had his 21st birthday. Our only pay was milk and meat. We had some chickens, and I set as many hens as I could and sold the baby chicks. I sold butter, too, to buy a few clothes and lamp oil and things like that. Maudie sensed sadness in Mother's voice and knew those years had been hard for her and Father. Mother sometimes told of the time when her mother died. She was only 12 years old, and life had not been easy. Mother smiled down at Maudie, and her tiredness lifted from her eyes. "But at least we had each other," she said, "and we had Tobe and Sarah." The children nodded their heads and continued snapping beans in a manner more subdued than only a few minutes before. Mother leaned out to look into the basket. She then told Maudie and Giddly that they could go and gather coal as soon as they finished snapping the beans that were in their laps. Maudie looked at Giddly's pile and wondered if she could beat him. She began snapping beans fast and throwing them into the dishpan so hard that they flew out the other side. "What do you think you're doing, Maudie?" Giddly asked in disgust. "You don't have to throw the beans around just because you want to get done." "I didn't mean to," she answered sheepishly, and then tried to be more careful. "May we take Mary along, Mother?" "I don't care. Just make sure she doesn't try to stand up in the wagon." Mary looked up and giggled in pleasure. "Go? Go?" she asked. "Yes, you may go," Mother tickled her chin, But Mary jerked away. She toddled to the edge of the porch, turned around, then slid off the side on her belly. "Don't you know what steps are for?" Giddly asked, jumping up to help her down. "We're not going right away, anyhow." But Mary didn't care. She followed the cat as it ambled lazily away and tried to catch its tail. Whenever she touched it, the cat jerked it away. As soon as Maudie finished snapping her pile of beans, she shook off the little ends that clung stubbornly to her dress and hurried to the barn to get the wagon. "Here, Giddly, I'll finish your pile so you can go," Sarah offered. Joyfully, Giddly dumped his beans into Sarah's lap and jumped off the porch, sailing over the steps. "He doesn't know what steps are for either," Mother chuckled. "That's for sure," Sarah agreed. "He doesn't know what holding still is either." Maudie pulled the badly rusted wagon out of the barn, and it rattled and bumped noisily over the rough ground. She stopped to let Giddly help Mary sit down on it. "Now hang on tight," he instructed her. Her chubby hands clung to the sides as they traveled along the worn path that led to the railroad. The train that passed each afternoon usually dropped pieces of coal. The children picked these up for fuel. Sometimes the Brakey, the man who walked along on top of the train to make sure all was well, would throw coal down for them. This was a real treat, for then they didn't need to hunt for the little pieces. The sky was clear, and meadowlarks whistled around them. "Goody, goody, goody!" Wild sunflowers grew in the ditch beside the railroad, and several wild plum trees, too. Maudie dropped the tongue of the wagon and skipped to the scrubby trees to pick the small tart plums. Only a few clung to the thin branches. She guessed the birds had helped themselves. "Naughty birds! No wonder you sing goody, goody, goody! I'd sing goody, too, if I ate as many plums as you do," she called to them. Gathering the few that remained, she stored them in the pockets of her dress to take to Mother. Then she heard a faint rumbling noise that caused her to lift her head and listen. Giddly heard it too, and they looked at each other with wide, excited eyes. "The train's coming! The train's coming!" Giddly shouted as he ran in wide circles around little Mary. She giggled and clapped her hands. "Here, Mary, we'll have to get way back so the cinders won't hit you when the train comes past," Maudie told her as she picked up the tongue of the wagon and turned it around. Now they could hear the train plainly, and soon saw a dark object on the horizon. The three children watched and listened in anticipation. Soon the low, rumbling noise became a distant pulsation, and they could see the smoke boiling from the monstrous engine. Maudie and Giddly sat down in the wagon beside Mary to wait for the train. Their hands clutched nervously to the sides. With her heart pounding in her ears, Maudie suddenly decided to put more distance between them and the railroad. Jumping up, she grabbed the tongue of the wagon and jerked it around so swiftly that poor little Mary toppled over the side. "What are you doing?" yelled Giddly. "We've got to get farther back," Maudie shouted. She sat Mary on her hip, grabbed the wagon tongue again, and tried to run. Giddly sat heavily in it and made it hard to pull. She gave a mighty jerk, desperate to put more distance between themselves and the train. This time, Giddly went sprawling in the dust, but Maudie did not care. Giddly should have been more concerned, she thought. At least she and Mary would be safe. What if the train derailed right where they were? She had heard of that happening, and usually people got killed. Still, Giddly sat in the exact spot where he had fallen. He wasn't afraid of a little old train, he claimed. But Maudie knew better. She knew he was only trying to make her feel silly. Holding Mary a little tighter, she could now see the windows in the engine. And then the terrible machine was swiftly there and thundering past. The ground shook from the vibrations of the engine, and the noise was almost unbearable. Giddly jumped up and began waving wildly to the engineer. He hopped from one foot to the other, waving with both arms. But Maudie and Mary watched with large, solemn eyes. Car after car went clickety-clacking past until Maudie began to feel a little dizzy. She looked farther down the endless line of cars, hoping to see the Brakey. And suddenly, there he was, pitching coal from a coal car. Maudie waved to him. Then all too soon, the train was past, and the caboose was disappearing on the wide prairie. Maudie sat Mary back into the wagon and pulled it up to the tracks. The sun was sinking fast, and they suddenly realized they must hurry, for Mother would need the coal to cook their supper, and they certainly did not want to delay that. End chapter 2.